I think, he's showing that the money, a return on the money being invested. But what I think we can do better. I think we can invest that money in Iowa banks and credit unions for $2.5 billion, and we can get an additional economic lift from having that money invested in our banks and credit unions. So rule of thumb is that for every dollar that we can keep in Iowa banks and through our economy, there's this, a 7x multiplier in terms of the economic lift. So there's an incentive. There's a reason why our state wants to try to keep our money in state, not just financial return is just one part of that. There's two components to that equation.
You talked about IPERS as a retention tool.
Yeah.
Sometimes you hear public employees say, maybe I could do something else, but I don't want to lose my IPERS.
Yeah.
It's like handcuffs. Do you think we need to look at the portability rules like the DOGE task force talked about?
Well, I think there is portability in terms of a worker who wants to leave. They can take their pile of IPERS money with them and take it to the private sector. But I think we need to keep the eye on the ball in terms of what IPERS provides. IPERS provides that retirement security for those hardworking Iowans, whether it's the corrections officers or our teachers. They don't want to be investment professionals. And the advantage of a public pension is that they have a defined benefit. They know what the amount of money is that they're going to get upon retirement. So that takes some of the timing. We as humans are not very good when it comes to financial planning and understanding market behavior. We tend to make sometimes the wrong decisions at the wrong time if you have a market correction or collapse. And so if you're part of a pension fund, you don't have to worry about that. You've got professionals who are doing that for you. So you hear it out on the campaign trail that IPERS workers, a lot of these people are mission oriented. They're not job hoppers. They're not looking to go, try to make the most amount of money. Our teachers who want to educate our future. And so I think we have to understand the importance of IPERS as a recruitment and retention tool. If we didn't have IPERS, we probably have to pay public employees more, simply because we've taken that benefit away. I think IPERS as a public pension fund, the private sector has moved away from pension funds, but that's not a good reason for the state to move away. And one of the differences with the state companies come and go. They're bought and sold. If you've got a pension fund and you're a corporation, then that becomes a liability that somebody has to manage. Well, guess what? The state has a perpetual mission. So this is something that the state can offer, a public pension program that most of the private sector doesn't offer. So it's a point of differentiation. It's not a point that we should eliminate. We don't see it so much in the private sector.
Staying on IPERS, did I understand right? You said there's a couple of structural problems with the system.
Yeah.
How do you understand those structural problems? What can you
Well,
enumerate them?
yeah, I think when IPERS was separated from the executive branch, and you have to go back and look at the early 2000s, the idea was to make it more independent. But at the time, for whatever reason, the legislature really didn't make the board fully autonomous and independent. So you have a voting member of 7 people. One of the 7 is the treasurer. The other 6 appointments is the governor. So we have a lot of power concentrated in a political position in the governor, who does the hiring, the firing, and also appoints 6 out of these 7 board members. If you would look around and see best practices, I think ultimately it would be in Iowa's interest, of course this would be up to the legislature to decide, but to really move more authority and control to the board of directors in terms of the hiring and firing decisions and the long-term thinking behind managing that program. The state definitely has an interest. I'm not saying the state doesn't have an interest. It's the sponsor. The legislature is the sponsor of the plan. But I think having governance that's better aligned with the membership and the long-term interest of the membership, we're running that fund for the benefit of the members. That's something I think we should be looking at. The Financial Times wrote about this in May, the governance issues and the fact that the management issues we've seen and the problems we've seen are a reflection of the governance problems. Professor Eric Lye, who's the chair of the finance department at the University of Iowa, has written extensively on this. We lack some transparency as to what's going on right now with with IPERS, we have lack transparency in the portfolio. Professor Lai has suggested the portfolio is too complicated. We introduced apparently performance bonuses after Mike Fitzgerald left, and I think that's contributing to some of the problems that we're seeing within the management side of things. But that chief risk officer that I mentioned, that position hasn't been filled. Previously, that position was reporting to the person, the investment officer, that the risk officer is supposed to be overseeing. That doesn't make sense. The risk officer ought to be reporting to the board of directors, maybe the CEO, but not to the person he or she is overseeing.
On that risk officer, do you know whether they advertised the position or attempted to fill the position? Have they interviewed anybody?
Question, Lori. That's a very good question.
Speaking of the hiring, firing, I guess, how do you feel about the governor's decision, the hiring of the new CEO?
Well, I think it's a little bit unfortunate. You've got two sides of the story. You want to have capable management, I think, in place because the market doesn't wait around, you know. And if we're not properly positioned, the portfolio, I mean, that could have consequences depending on how the portfolio is structured. So, on one hand, we want to have a CEO in place. I would have preferred to see two things happen. One would be an independent investigation. The governor should not be, her office should not be investigating the issues that her own hire, may or may not have been responsible for. So you hire an outside expert to do what's called a fiduciary audit. That would have been one of the things. The other thing I would probably have done was bring in an interim CEO. So you bring in someone with expertise to fill out the rest of her term, and then you let the next governor, kind of a Merrick Garland kind of point. Let the next governor make that decision, but ultimately, I don't think we ought to have governors appointing who come and go, appointing the IPERS CEO. That ought to be responsibility of the board of directors. That's a long-term conversation.
You may understand what difference it makes for Robbie Smith left.
I think it's hard to do this job unless you are full-time here in the metro. That's the key thing.
What's he missing out on?
I don't think he's here full-time. That's what I've been told.
But what can't he do?
I don't think he can do the treasurer's job remotely. I think there are things having to do with financial controls, for example, that from internet, it's not just firing up your computer. You're dealing with lots of money and certain protocols. I'm not an IT expert, but I think you need to do. You need to. It's not just when session is when the legislature is in session. You need to be present and visible. You need to be talking with legislators. When in session, out of session, you should be talking. I believe as the CFO, you should be running around hearing the stories from Iowa. And you've got all the access to real-time information. So, you're going to be one of the people with the best information. And you've got a big picture, you're representing all the people. You're not a legislator with a certain constituent group. You should be thinking about broadly what's happening in the state of Iowa. And how do we do things that both benefit maybe interior Iowa, but some of the border cities we talked about. I mean, we got to be mindful of what's going on in these other border states. That's important. And you can't do that if you're sitting behind the desk. Or you're just, trying to work from home.
What's the role of this office with water quality? You talked about Batch and Build, which is a program that Chris Jones has critiqued also.
Water quality is a hugely important issue. And I think having a treasurer who understands something about agriculture is very important. Our agricultural economy here, we're a state, I think, with the most concentrated percentage of our GDP having to do with agriculture or agriculture-related industries. So, as goes agriculture, often, so goes our economy. So understanding how our agriculture works is important. And then trying to understand how, if water quality, one of the consequences of our water quality is bad soil health. Why do we have bad soil health? Because we grow just two crops. Corn and soybeans primarily. And when you do that, the structure of the soil breaks down. Biology isn't healthy, so it doesn't have structure. It doesn't have the ability to either absorb water or hold on to that water as healthy soil would do. So if we can begin to add these third crops, and the oats is an example of that, then we can improve bankers on board. The bankers may be nervous about farmers growing a third crop. The farmers may be nervous about it too. The insurance, the crop insurance as an example. Crop insurance is all built around historic markets. Well, if we're developing new markets for food-grade oats, for example, and we don't have a good crop insurance market history, how do we do that? So we gotta begin to align the financial drivers and understand the financial constraints. The Treasury really should be working with the legislature and with the Secretary of Agriculture and the governor, we're all a team, and figuring out what we need to do specifically to add these third crops. They're not going to happen on their own. It takes a lot of intention. It takes teamwork to be able to do that. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Kind of on that, you brought up vouchers today. How would you work with the legislature, to address the spending that voucher
Yeah.
costs without?
Well, one of the things, again, you learn on the campaign trail is you listen a lot. And I'm a person in my history and my business work, I work with probably more Republicans than I do Democrats and independents as well. And one of the things I've tested is that when you talk to people who are pro-voucher, and you then ask them and you test them, you say, well, hey, we have a structural budget deficit here, and these costs are just escalating. Would you be in sort of some kind of income or needs test? I mean, virtually everyone I've spoken to says yes. So I think that would be a place to start, as we begin to have a needs test, an income test. I think we had that at the start of the voucher program. And help put some brakes, because the idea, I don't think, I don't know what the right level is. If you're making $300,000 or $400,000 a year, you probably want to send your kid to private school. You probably could do that on your own. You don't need the taxpayer money to do that, and there's an opportunity cost. So don't spend if we're spending the $300 million on the vouchers, then we don't have that money to spend elsewhere. Our public schools, our universities, other economic development